Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining me today for my presentation for our divisions in religions portion of our course today. I will be talking about a specific portion as it relates to the divisions in religions section of our class today. I'll be discussing John Wesley's journey to the Georgia colony between October of 1735 to December of 1737. So please enjoy. And I do have one activity at the end. I will detail that a little bit to you. But yeah, let's get started. This is Wesley, the Georgia Mission, and the Native American population. Discussing the diverse experiences and perspectives of John Wesley in relation to multi-religious expression, one must first consider his experiences on his mission to Georgia that occurred from October of 1735 to December of 1737. John Wesley wanted to evangelize to Native American and Indian populations in the Georgia colony. John Wesley wanted to experience what he knew as primitive Christianity. We'll get to the definition of that term soon. But various beliefs drove John Wesley to venture to the Georgia colony in 1735. But the primary force behind his missionary experience was to act on his theological and ecclesiological convictions. John Wesley's experiences in the Georgia colony while attempting to evangelize and convert Native American Indians shaped his perspectives on different religions and salvation decades after he returned to Europe from his missionary journey. John Wesley's missionary journey to the Georgia colony to evangelize to the Native American Indian population in 1735 shaped his perspective on various religions and God's salvation for the rest of his life. Now, before his missionary journey in 1735, John Wesley was educated in a predominantly Anglican environment. According to Jordan Hammond's John Wesley in America, Restoring Primitive Christianity, he says that it was the religious ideal of primitive Christianity that exerted a profound influence on John Wesley during the last few years he spent at Oxford before making the bold decision to become a missionary in the recently established colony of Georgia, which was chartered in 1732. This impulse to restore the purity of the early church was an established tradition within Anglicanism that was mediated to John Wesley through his high church predecessors, including his parents. And that, again, is from Jordan Hammond's work. This impulse, again, attending Oxford and being raised by Anglican parents, John Wesley, he was proximate to Anglican religious traditions that informed the theological and missional ideologies that undergirded his theological perspectives on the Christian church and his evangelical call to communities in the Georgia colony. Now, beginning as a child and continuing throughout his time at Oxford University, John Wesley was influenced by the Anglican tradition and his parents, both of them affirming his ideological interest in the concept of primitive Christianity. Now, primitive Christianity is defined contextually by Jordan Hammond. And again, it's defined in John Wesley in America, Restoring Primitive Christianity. Now, it's defined through examples of John Wesley's application of this principle. Now, Hammond states that Wesley, and I quote, Wesley was fully committed to undergoing what he believed were the necessary hardships of a pioneer missionary. Part of this program of emulating the poverty of Christ in the primitive church was to be content and indeed count it a blessing to sleep rough. Now, here one can see that the primitive nature of this Christianity, in quote, I apologize, the primitive nature of this Christianity that Wesley was so interested by was a call to inward and outward simplicity, and even to a point discomfort, which is where we get that term sleeping rough. The pomp and circumstance of the church in England was contrary to what John Wesley had learned from his father, mother, and other Anglican influences at Oxford. Hammond states in John Wesley in America Restoring Primitive Christianity that, and I quote, while at Oxford, John Wesley read the epistles of Clement, Ignatius, and Polycarp, and all of the Anglican divines mentioned earlier. While his Oxford colleagues played a considerable role in stimulating his study of primitive Christianity, the influence of his father's advice should not be discounted. End quote. Now, Wesley has several early landmarks that explain his dedication to primitive Christianity, from his parents to his studies at Oxford University. With several academic influences, John Wesley became allegiant to the pursuit of a simple and thoughtful lifestyle. Wesley's early experiences and adoption of asceticism, which is synonymous with living a simple but thoughtful lifestyle, almost monastic. So Wesley's early experiences and adoption of asceticism led John Wesley to encounter cultures that countered his own physically, societally, and religiously. Despite Wesley's belief in the Christian faith, he saw the opportunity for evangelism to those who do not believe in God but are living simple or primitive lifestyles, adjacent to the example of Jesus. Now, Jordan Hammond states in his article, John Wesley's mindset at the commencement of his Georgia sojourn, suffering, and the introduction of primitive Christianity to the Indians, that, and I quote, he took the controversial position of praising what he saw as the simple lifestyle of the Indian, which he believed was more akin to life in the apostolic era than that of contemporary England, end quote. Now, John Wesley saw his first interaction with non-Christian persons as an opportunity for evangelism as well as an ascetic immersion experience. Wesley saw the Native American Indian population in the Georgia colony, as ideologically and religiously distant, but proximate to Christianity in terms of lifestyle. Again, that's where this asceticism comes in. Hammond states that in the same article listed above, and I quote, Wesley's letter of October 10th, 1735 to Burton has often rightly been cited as evidence of his mindset going into the Georgia mission. Biographers have repeatedly focused on his commitment that his chief motive, to which all the rest are subordinate, is the hope of saving my soul. And that was a quote from Wesley. Again, quoting Hammond, and have seen this is continuing the quote, and have seen this as foreshadowing or embodying his crisis of faith leading to his evangelical conversion. Now that was Hammond quoting a letter that was written, and it was talking about how John Wesley was not only going to evangelize to the Native American Indian population, but John Wesley also saw this evangelism opportunity as an opportunity to deepen his own faith. And so that's really going to be important as we continue. Also, as you can see, we have a lot of sources by Jordan Hammond. They might all sound the same, but they actually are all different. So stick with me. I promise we'll all get there together. John Wesley's goal was not only to evangelize the Native American Indian population, but also to deepen his own faith. Upon his arrival to the Georgia colony, John Wesley began immersing himself in the Native American Indian lifestyle. In this article, John Wesley's mindset at the commencement of his Georgia sojourn, suffering, and the introduction of primitive Christianity to the Indians. Again, that's Jordan Hammond. Hammond details John Wesley's immersion and mindset in the following manner. And I quote, Wesley was convicted that for himself, certain means to holy living could be more readily accomplished whilst living in a primitive environment with the Indians. First of all, unwieldy passions and lusts of the flesh could be conquered through ascetic living. A simple diet based on water and the fruits of the earth coupled with living amongst foreign women, would be a means to mortify the lusts of the flesh and imitate the apostolic life of celibate asceticism. Living amongst Indian women who are almost of a different species would do little to gratify the lusts of the eye and would put him in close touch with God's creation. The pride of life, understood in terms of materialism, had not infected the wilds of America. While Burton urged him not to be put off by light scoffs of the idle and profane, Wesley was convinced that such persecution and contempt that he was sure to labor under would be a welcome support to holy living. End quote. John Wesley's interaction with his new culture was in a manner akin to many mission trips even seen today. Most are touted as promised ascetic environments with the purpose of serving in less fortunate communities, or, in the words of John Wesley, primitive environments. And in those environments, you would evangelize in some way, whether it be through service, speech, word, or deed. John Wesley constantly attempted to evangelize to the Native American Indian population in the Georgia colony, but he failed several times. As his time in the Georgia colony ended in 1737, Wesley left the colony not having done the evangelistic work he set out to do. He actually didn't meet his goal, which was to basically change the lives of these Native American individuals, and for lack of a better term, they weren't having it. So Jordan Hammond states in John Wesley's commencement of his Georgia sojourn that, and I quote, "Despite his best intentions, Wesley was not able to put this goal into practice." End quote. John Wesley took this experience and used it to ideologically contextualize many of his encounters with religions other than Christianity. Wesley began to see all other religious expressions in a negative light. Randy Maddow states, and I quote, "Wesley's disillusionment in Georgia coincided with his heightened appreciation for the Protestant emphasis on distinctively Christian grace. As a result, the period shortly following 1738 evidenced his most negative evaluations of initial universal revelation. He did not deny it, but he saw it as nearly empty." End quote. John Wesley, as seen in his missionary goals and tactics in the Georgia colony, sought only to evangelize and commodify other cultures and religions, not to accept them as they were. He often saw the ascetic value in these cultures and cultural experiences and religions, but he refused to accept the spiritual or theistic value of the religious practices that were outside of Christianity. Speaking about Native American practices, Maddow writes in his article titled "Wesley as Theological Mentor" that, and I quote, "A second identifiable group of heathen in Wesley's considerations were the tribal religions of Africa and North America." And North America would have been considered where Native American and the Indian population were, where he was in the Georgia colony. Now, back to the quote from Maddow. Most of his comments on this group focus on Native Americans because he had some direct experiences with them. His actual encounters with Native Americans soon disabused him of this fanciful image. His immediate reaction was quite strong. He reclassified their religion as demonic. End quote. As I stated before, Wesley's experiences with the Native American population in the Georgia colony had an obvious effect on him and his interreligious theology throughout his life. While Wesley was clearly allegiant to the Christian faith prior to his time in Georgia, upon his return in 1737 of that December, he seems to have become adamant about the refutability of any religion other than Christianity, flat out, because of his experiences, possibly, one could see, because of his experiences at the Georgia colony and his perceived failure. As time went on and Wesley became further removed from his disappointment, so the stung went away for a little bit. He was further removed from his disappointment in the Georgia colony. His multi-religious beliefs did shift in small ways. Wesley began to focus on ideas such as prevenient grace, which Maddox details this way in his article. Again, the name of this article is Wesley as Mentor. And I quote, through his distinctive wedding of total depravity with universal prevenient grace, Wesley grounded the knowledge of God available to those who have not heard of Christ in an initial expression of the grace of restoration. In other words, Wesley was convinced that no one had access to God apart from the gracious restoration of divine self-revelation. However, he also believed that this revelation was available in a continuum of progressively more definitive expressions, beginning with a basic knowledge that was universally available and reaching definitive expressions in Christ. End quote. Wesley developed a theology that made room for those who did not believe in God expressed in Jesus Christ and his sacrifice. He did this by offering a track that made salvation possible for them. Wesley's theology of prevenient grace offers the opportunity to receive said grace from God upon the confession of belief in the Christian God. Now, prevenient grace, as I understand it, states that God makes room and is revealed for those who believe in the Christian God. But people with religious beliefs such as Native American Indian tribes of the Georgia colony would have to abandon their beliefs and accept Jesus as their savior and Christianity as their sole religion. Maddow details several perspectives Wesley had on various religions in relation to Judaism. Maddow states in the article, Wesley is, and I quote, when Wesley did describe contemporary Judaism, he tended to echo the negative evaluations that Palin has shown were common in his time. And yet, at least in his later years, he refused to condemn Jews summarily, arguing that Christians should leave their fate in the hands of God, end quote. Now, in relation to Islam, Maddow states that Wesley was somewhat brutal. Maddow's article reads as follows. In general, Islam received more focused and, if possible, more distorted and hostile treatment than Judaism in Christian evaluations from the 13th century on. Two factors account for much of this situation: the military clashes between the two faiths and the ironic apologetic method, which transformed many of the arguments used to defend the superiority of Christianity over Judaism into comparisons of Islam versus Christianity. The reactionary evaluations of Islam continued into Wesley's immediate context. As such, it is hardly surprising that he would include a recital of the barbarities of Islamic practices and the absurdities of the Quran in his collation of empirical evidence of the reality of human depravity. Just how negative and misinformed Wesley's general impression of Islam was is best seen in his judgment that Mohammedans hardly differ from heathens in their lack of revelation, religious sensitivity, and moral concern, end quote. Now, Maddow also offers an 18th century reflection on Buddhism and Hinduism, stating that, and I quote, a third possible group of heathens were the more developed religions of India and China. There was very little information about Buddhism available in Britain before the 19th century. Likewise, the few accounts of China that were available to Wesley dealt only in broad strokes with Chinese culture and were not very reliable even on these topics, as he realized. By contrast, there were relatively more treatments of Hinduism published in Britain in the latter half of the 18th century. End quote. Now, suffice to say, there was no room for interreligious expression in the 18th century. There was only room for singular Christian belief. Now, as time went on, John Wesley had no real lenience for multi-religious or interreligious consideration, but he soon garnered a theology of prevenient grace that made it possible for those who were not Christians to be a part of the Christian faith. This may not be revolutionary in our 21st century context, but in the 18th century, though seemingly harsh and biased, Wesley was somewhat radical in his thinking. This is not to say that any form of intolerance should be condoned, but it would be academically expedient to consider Wesley's work in theology in its periodic context. While the method and motives behind his missionary outreach were biased, Wesley was attempting to understand and include people from other religions, people who were simply being killed or at best ostracized from society by others in the 18th century. Some could even argue that Wesley's theology of prevenient grace could serve as a case study for today's Christian church on missionary and interreligious practices, as well as evangelical theology. Wesley, although biased in his approach, still teaches us about the salvific potential in every person and in every religion, whether directly or indirectly. Wesley's disappointing missionary journey in 1737 arguably could have led to the understandings of evangelical approaches and interreligious theology some denominations still have to this day. So, the holistic point as we look through John Wesley's experiences, first going to that Georgia colony in 1735. When he returns in 1737, he seems jaded. And so that anger, that disillusionment that transfers into his theology in relation to interreligious and even some could say intercultural context. But like we see with his work Thoughts Upon Slavery that we read a little while ago, later on in John Wesley's life, he begins to return to some of these earlier experiences and have some introspective moments with himself where he reconsiders and reevaluates and recontextualizes some of those experiences and brings new meaning that offers new perspectives, not just to him in introspective moments, but also to denominations, to ecclesial bodies, to church bodies that now consider him a forefather of their religion. So even when we're looking at John Wesley's failings, misgivings, or bias as it relates to interreligious theologies, interreligious relations, we also have to consider, again, academically, its periodic context and the fact that things such as prevenient grace did open the door for some different theological concepts because of, though lacking, John Wesley's perspectives as it relates to interreligious theology. So, a last thing, and this is the activity that I was discussing a little bit. If you have time, I'd like for you to take a look at the lecture by Terry LeBlanc below about Native American theology. And I would like for you to ask yourself, and you could even post it in the discussion. If Dr. Labode says that that's okay, I don't want to impose. But ask yourself after watching either video, what Wesley may have to say about this theistic explanation of Native American religion. Would this explanation provide the theological basis? Wesley needed to consider Native American religion in and of itself authoritative without any Western Christian influence, although some of it is somewhat syncretic, some could say. And lastly, what would Wesley think of some of LeBlanc's critiques of Christianity and commentary on biblical text? Because Professor LeBlanc does offer some of that as well in either of the videos. You don't have to listen to LeBlanc's lecture, but it is here as a resource. And I would encourage you to listen to either the long lecture, which is about like 39 minutes, or the shorter lecture, which is about like 15 or 20 minutes, especially if you've never encountered any form of Native American theology or religion prior to this discussion. So, again, blessings to you all. Thanks for sitting and listening, and I hope you all are doing well. Miss you all. Have an awesome day, and yeah, thanks so much.